haven't been together for a long, long time between my accident and, of course, the virus situation. And today we're going to visit a topic that we were going to do in March, and that's the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, which was the last major, well, at least the last major wartime conference in which Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt met. And I want to thank April. It was April's idea to do this in the reading room because we have a fireplace. And in a sense, I'm replicating FDR's, not that I'm FDR, but FDR's fireside chats. So please bear with me. This is our first session in this format, and we're going to be testing, and you're going to be testing as well, whether I'm comfortable, more importantly, whether you're comfortable. So Yalta, Y-A-L-T-A, on the Crimea, and the beginning of the Yalta Conference really takes place at the Tehran Conference in November of 1943. And we've talked about this when we were in the larger room, but at Tehran, as I said a moment ago, this is the first and only meeting of the three major allies of World War II, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. And just a few items about each man's personality. Churchill was always full of himself. If there was a chance to talk, Churchill took it, and he never relinquished the floor. And for Churchill, his goals during the war and after the war were, one, to maintain the British Empire, two, to keep the Soviets out of Eastern Europe, and three, to make certain that Germany, to some extent, was restored economically for the economic recovery of Europe in post-1945. For Stalin wanted to make certain that all of Eastern Europe was under the control of Moscow, and that Poland in particular heeded the directions of Moscow, but the directions of Stalin, because Poland had been the corridor, through which the German army had invaded twice. Once in 1914-15 with World War I, and secondly, of course, in a much more aggressive and disturbing way, and dangerous way, destructive way, that's a better word, destructive way, was in 41, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which for Hitler would be the basis of the Third Reich. And for Roosevelt, Roosevelt wanted to charm. See, Roosevelt always felt he could charm everybody, and he was very good at it. And he would always say, yes, yes, yes. And Eleanor Roosevelt would, be outside the room when someone came outside the room. Not at Yalta. She was not at Yalta. But anytime Roosevelt met with someone, she would say, how did it go? And the person with whom she was speaking would say, oh, it went very, very well. The president said, yes, yes, yes. And she said, my dear, the president agrees with everyone. Yes, yes, yes. He wants to work with people. And Roosevelt hoped, that he could work with Stalin, and that he could charming Stalin, and that he could accept Stalin as Stalin wished to be accepted as a major world power, both economically and also militarily. And again, it's the charming of Stalin. Stalin was not to be charmed at all. And Stalin was the best prepared person at Yalta in February of 1945. And as I said, Yalta was to be our topic in March of this year, and it was the last major wartime conference. By the time the Allies met in Potsdam in July of 1945, Churchill had been voted out of office, Roosevelt was dead, and Stalin was there at Potsdam to talk basically about how Germany would be treated after the war. So let's get to Yalta in February of 1945. Roosevelt had been advised, we're going to focus on Roosevelt and Stalin. Roosevelt had been advised by his aides not to go to Yalta. Roosevelt was a dying man. His blood pressure was 130/240, and that's on medication. I mean, he was a dying man, and he knew it. His personal physicians knew it. But Roosevelt insisted, I want to go to Yalta and, in effect, make that 14,000-mile round trip. He felt it was important for the three of them, Churchill and Stalin, to talk about the configuration of the post-war Europe. And as I said, Stalin was concerned about controlling all of Eastern Europe and certainly Poland. You know that the Polish nation at the end of World War II, 20% of the population of Poland was dead, by the end of the war. So when they met at Yalta, and by the way, they met in the summer palace of Tsar Nicholas II, and certainly Roosevelt and Churchill complained every day, every night, about the bed bugs. And speaking of bugs, and their quarters were bugged, by the NKVD. So they knew everything, that had been talked about privately. And the only way to escape this was they would go out in the woods, and Churchill would talk privately with his aides as to, how to handle Stalin, and Roosevelt as well. The basic questions at Yalta was, one, what to do about Eastern Europe, and secondly, how to handle a defeated Germany. And it was clear by February of 1945 that the Germans were on the ropes. They had it. And thirdly, and this was so true for Franklin Roosevelt, that he wanted the Soviets to join him in the war, to wrap up the war against the Japanese. Roosevelt won't see this, Truman will. And thirdly, to create a United Nations and to bring Stalin in, and to bring Stalin into the UN as a major economic power, military power, and force in the world. And for Roosevelt, that he did not want the United States to retreat into isolationism as it had at the end of World War I. That we too, America, is a major world power, and the only way to preserve the peace is to have all of the major players in the UN to talk, rather than to wage war. So let's get down to business here. We already have, in a matter of speaking. Roosevelt chaired the meeting, and Roosevelt was not on top of his game, and certainly Churchill's physician, Lord Moran, would lean into Churchill's ear and say, the president is dying. He cannot focus on the conversations. And if one looks at some of the video from the Yalta Conference, you can see that Roosevelt is slow, that his head is moving slowly from left to right. He cannot keep up with the conversation. He cannot follow. This isn't the old Roosevelt, that I almost said love, some people didn't. For many people, he was that man, that man in a wheelchair. That this was not the Roosevelt that the American people had elected 4 times. The 22nd Amendment was not on the books yet. And Roosevelt was slow. His head moved slowly, struggling to keep up with the conversation and to follow. And to follow what was being said by Churchill and Stalin. Stalin rarely spoke. He grunted. He had his position papers. He was the best prepared person at the conference. Even Churchill's secretary said, he is the best man here. Stalin knew what he wanted, and he wanted complete control over Eastern Europe. And by the way, he got that, and he turned Eastern Europe into a gulag, into a prison colony. And I'll give you one example of that. And boy, this speaks to the issue. When Stalin returned to Moscow, he put Warsaw, he put all of Eastern Europe on Moscow's time. And if you have that kind of juice, if you have that kind of power, where you can put an entire section of Europe on Moscow's time, you have control. You see, Stalin, when he picked up the phone in Moscow at 3 p.m., he wanted it to be 3 p.m. across all of Eastern Europe. His role was grotesque, and he turned all of Eastern Europe into a into a prison colony, into a gulag. Roosevelt wished to work with Stalin after the war and to get him, one, to join the United Nations and also to join in the final assault against Japan. For Churchill, basically, as I said, is restore the economy of Germany and to protect the British Empire and to maintain England as a Mediterranean power, certainly in the Eastern Mediterranean. There was so much at stake at Yalta. In fact, I'll really jump the narrative here. As late as 1975, we're talking, 30 years later, at the Helsinki Conference, it was finally at the Helsinki Conference that the changed borders, particularly the Polish border, as a change at the end of World War II, was finally accepted by Poland and finally accepted by all the European nations. You see, with regard to the Japanese, with ending the war against the Japanese, that Roosevelt in February of 1945, he's still alive, he doesn't pass until April, Roosevelt, until not April of 1945. These were the numbers, that Roosevelt had, and the very same numbers that Truman had. We'll talk about Truman, at the close of our conversation. In February of 1945, the estimates of what it would take to defeat the Japanese is that it would take, at a minimum, there would be 250,000 American casualties. That was a minimalistic number. Some estimates were 500,000, some were 1 million, some were 1.5 million. And by the way, Americans do not take casualties well. The Soviets did. They suffered 15, 20 million deaths, with the German invasion. You see, this is where Hitler was going to build his Third Reich in all of Eastern Europe. If one reads Mein Kampf, and it's not worth reading, by the way, it's turgid and slow and so forth. But if you read the section on German expansion, a Third Reich, the First Reich was Bismarck. The First Reich was Charlemagne. The Second Reich was Bismarck. And the Third Reich, which would endure 1,000 years, would be Hitler's Reich. As Hitler always bragged, as Hitler always said, men like me come along once in 1,000 years. Boy, that's a good thing. And the Third Reich would be built in all of Eastern Europe and parts of Western Russia. And we will teach the Russians enough German to read street signs and to follow orders and push them beyond the Ural Mountains. The Third Reich, 1,000 years. It lasted 12, maybe 13, depending on what your numbers are. But for Roosevelt in February of 45, he knew American casualties would be astronomical. He also knew this, that as his military planners told him, Douglas MacArthur, George Marshall, who was chief of staff, that the last battles, the war would not end against the Japanese sometime in early 46, or not early 46 rather, sometime in early 47 or late in 1947. What Roosevelt did know, and this was his mindset, that the Japanese had already adopted their national slogan for resistance. And it was frightening. It was terrifying. The Japanese fought to the last man, woman, and soldier. And the slogan was, 1 million people die proudly. We will not surrender to the round eyes. And you might notice I have a black eye here. And it's beginning to diminish, and I fell, not in combat, I fell over guard nose. Not as dramatic, but nonetheless you can probably still, see it, depending on how clear the vision is on your telephone. So with that, I need Stalin's help. And if you look at a map, it's quite clear, that the Soviet forces would attack from Manchuria from the north, while MacArthur's forces would come from the south, and they would envelop the Japanese army, and sometime in 47, as early as the spring, as late as the fall, the Japanese would be compelled to surrender. Maybe yes, maybe no. For Churchill, as I've said, to protect the interests of the British Empire in the Middle East and especially in India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. And again, for the Middle East, it was just becoming apparent how rich the Middle East was in oil. And oil would be the gold of the, I'm saying gold, would be the gold of the post-war world. We need to get the Soviets into the UN, to treat them, as Roosevelt said, to treat them as, well, to treat them as brothers. You know that Stalin, that Stalin appeared on the cover of Time magazine 14 times. You know, he was seen as our ally, and there was so much covered up about what was going on, the gulags, the executions, if you will, the purges of Stalin's Russia. Stalin was suspicious of everyone. I want to go back to the Tehran Conference for a moment. And at Tehran in November of '43, two major questions were decided. One, when would the invasion of Europe take place in France and then push on across the Rhine River? And the other question was who would lead it? And at Tehran, I don't mean to move around here, but thoughts are occurring as I chat with you over this new format, that, you see, Stalin, the Russian people were suffering tremendously, you know, with the German attack. By 42, the German army was in the suburbs of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. And then the snows came, the mud came, the winter, and that stalled the German advance. And for Stalin, he felt that the reason Churchill and Roosevelt had delayed the Second Front to take the pressure off Russia was that they hoped that Germany and Russia would bleed themselves to death, and Roosevelt's armies, Churchill's armies would come into all of Central Europe. The Nazism would be exhausted, communist Russia would be destroyed, and that we would win our victory, Churchill and Roosevelt, we would win our victory with minimal losses and control all of Central Europe. And you know, Stalin conceded to his foreign minister, Molotov, if I were Churchill, if I were Roosevelt, that's the exact thing that I would do. Stall and stall and stall the Second Front. That we don't have enough landing craft, we don't have enough supplies, we don't have enough soldiers. And that if they stall long enough, Germany would be exhausted, Hitler would be defeated, Stalin's Russia would be defeated, and the Allies would win everything. Stalin was a suspicious man. You know, in his meeting rooms, the floors were always wood, so he could hear anybody approaching. And also the drapes everywhere in his bedroom, or whatever, were always about 3 or 4 feet off the floor, so he could see if anybody was hiding. Their shoes would show, hiding behind the drapes to step out and to assassinate him. Stalin feared assassination. He never flew. He always took his armored train with him. And it was Stalin who agreed on meeting in Crimea. And as he said later on, if I knew that Roosevelt was so sick, and not the Roosevelt we knew in 32, 33, 34, perhaps we could have agreed on a site that was less difficult for Roosevelt. Roosevelt wanted to meet with Stalin face to face. This is the last meeting of the Big Three. By the end of the war, as I said, Roosevelt was dead. Churchill had been voted out of office, and Stalin and Potsdam, what do we do about a defeated Germany? And that was part of the conversation at Yalta as well. Stalin wanted to execute 30 or 40,000 German officers. Churchill agreed with him as well. And Roosevelt toyed with the idea, and then he dismissed it. He toyed with the idea of turning Germany, you know, into pasture and to a completely demilitarized state, and also to have what became the Nuremberg trials. Maybe some night, some morning, some afternoon, you know, depending on where we meet, you know, we can talk about the scope of the Nuremberg trials and how, you know, each of the Allied powers, particularly the Soviet Union, wanted to, deal with the Nuremberg trials. But more about that, at a later time. When Roosevelt died in April of 1945, Hitler, Goebbels, his propaganda minister, were ecstatic. The greatest war criminal in the history of the world is dead. And maybe we can win our war, if we get lucky and we persevere. That was impossible. That was simply dreaming. Oh, by the way, I should mention, that Hitler appeared on the cover of Time magazine twice. This is before the war, once in 38 and once in 39, in which he was described as the man of the year. Not because of the pogroms and the appearance of concentration camps, but rather because of the impact he'd had on the history of Europe, the history of the world before the war. In fact, I'm going to give you a homework assignment. Go to the archives of Time magazine and read the essay. And read the essay as to why the editorial board chose Hitler as the man of the year. That's an assignment that I give. And that's an intriguing read. And that's before the rest of the story. And it's an interesting read, and you can read it in 20 minutes and take mental note on it. No, just like if anyone knew what was coming, like many times our lives, if anyone knew what was really coming. It's like when you say, I do, I never put up my hand for this. So, take a look at it. And maybe 39 to 38 is the one that's most interesting. That's the Munich conference, where it looked as if the sellout of Czechoslovakia would keep the peace. By the way, since I'm on the phrase sellout, Roosevelt's critics, before he died, Roosevelt's critics, and there were thousands of them. My grandmother was a critic of Franklin Roosevelt, that he gave away the nation's wealth. But the critics talked about Yalta as being the sellout of Eastern Europe. Roosevelt believed that he could trust Stalin to do the right thing. And one of the right things that he believed Stalin would do is they all signed a document before they adjourned 8 days later. It was called the Declaration, the Declaration of Europe, in which Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin all promised to, once the war was over, it's only February, to have open and free elections. Stalin had no intent of having open and free elections in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Baltic states. Oh, there would be elections, all right. That would be conducted from Moscow, and they would be favorable to the control of all of Eastern Europe by Stalin and whomever followed him. To come back to my point, my earlier point, you can see how I'm moving around here, that when Truman became president in April of 1945, and by the way, Truman wanted no part of the presidency. He wanted no part of being on the ticket in the 44 election at all, and that's another conversation for another afternoon or morning. And Truman was working with the very same numbers that Roosevelt was working with. At a minimum, 250,000 American casualties, maybe 1 million, maybe 1.5 million. And he also knew the slogan of resistance. 100 million people died proudly. But, unlike Roosevelt, who felt he could work with Stalin, by now it was quite clear what Stalin was doing in Eastern Europe. And Truman at one time said, Roosevelt would never ever have said this. At one time Truman said, Truman was a true man from Missouri. And Truman at one point said the only difference between Hitler and Stalin, the only difference is the size of their mustache. Roosevelt would never have said that. Truman did. He knew what was happening in Eastern Europe, and all the way to Moscow. Execution after execution after execution. One of the men that Stalin truly feared was Trotsky. Trotsky was an intellectual. Stalin never was. And he had Trotsky executed. Stalin feared men who were taller than him. Stalin was 5'4", and he kind of pushed away men who were taller than him. Trotsky was 5'10". I mean, that's not exactly Bill Russell, if you remember that name. And eventually that Truman, Stalin rather, will have Trotsky executed. He believed that Trotsky was the leader of an opposition group, and he had him read out of the Communist Party, Trotsky. He had Trotsky read out of Russia, and Trotsky fled to Mexico, where he was executed by Stalin's agents, the NKVD. And he died hard. You ready for this? They snuck into his bedroom, and they got him with an ice pick through the ear into the brain. Stalin was ruthless, whether it's having the drapes 3 feet from the ceiling. He even had his son. Stalin had 3 children. Yakov. Yakov became a Soviet pilot, and Yakov was shot down behind German lines. And this came to the attention of Hitler, obviously. Yakov was Stalin's son. And Hitler offered to Stalin, I'll give you your son back if you release X number of German POWs and officers. And Stalin said, absolutely not. He's in a German POW camp, and if he has been captured, he's no longer my son. He has been captured. I can no longer trust him, and he will bring the virus of democracy, if you will, to the Soviet Union. That's who we're talking about here. We're talking about a man who had 2 wives executed for various reasons. He did not trust his wives. Maybe there's a message there, I don't know. Sorry for the bad joke and for the bad comment. So, and Stalin died in his bed, with all the deaths, tens of thousands of deaths, maybe 1 million. He died in his bed with his boots on. So here's Truman, back to Truman. Truman wanted to keep the Russians out of the Japanese occupation because he knew what was going on in Eastern Europe. And he also had the numbers that Roosevelt had. But he had in his hip pocket something that Roosevelt did not have because it wasn't developed yet. And that was the successful testing of the atomic bomb. Nobody knew how powerful it was, but Truman was willing to use it and to see if the projected power of the atomic bomb might compel the Japanese military to surrender. It did not. It compelled the emperor, Hirohito, to surrender. And Hirohito went on the radio. Obviously, there was no television in Japan. He went on the radio, and he relieved all the Japanese people of their duty, their responsibility to die for him. And as Hirohito said, I can't do this to the Japanese, that we must accept the inevitable. We have to surrender. So I am relieving all of you, civilians and the military, of your duty to die for me. And it will be Truman, with the urging of MacArthur, who will allow Hirohito not to be executed at the end of the war. As far as MacArthur was concerned, that the Japanese will be far more docile if their emperor, a resigned emperor, can you imagine that? A resigned emperor who said that I am a sun god, to accept his word that you are relieved of your duty to die for me. So Truman ends the war, and I should mention his popularity was extraordinary. His poll numbers jumped to 88, 89, 91%. He's bringing he's bringing the men and women home. The war is over. There's so much that flows from the end. So much that flows from the end of World War II. We are still living in a world that was formed by the end of World War II. Now I know the Berlin Wall went down and all of that, but until that happened in 88, 89, or 90, Stalin and the Yalta Conference so framed and formulated the end of World War II. I should mention this, just popped in my mind. Churchill was voted out of office, at the end of the war. And Clement Attlee showed up. And at Potsdam, it was Attlee who was there instead of Churchill. It was Truman who was there instead of Roosevelt. Stalin was still a player, a major, major player. You know, when Stalin was listening, whether it's at Yalta or Tehran or at Potsdam, and Roosevelt's aides noticed this, that he always scribbled. He always took side notes. And the scribbling was the head of a wolf with its teeth out and saliva dripping off the teeth. Now that speaks to a lot of psychological problems of Stalin. You know, the menace of a wolf with sharp teeth and dripping with blood, with saliva. Who knew? The point is, it was menacing. When Churchill was voted out of office, and this is the beginning of the Cold War, when Churchill was voted out of office, Truman in 1946, in March of 1946, right, in March of 46, invited Churchill to Fullerton, Missouri, to give a major speech about how the world has become, and ostensibly to receive an honorary doctorate. And it will be at Fullerton, Missouri. And you can find this on YouTube. You can find me on YouTube, I think. And it will be Churchill who will give us the phrase, the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, that behind that all of Eastern Europe, and then he went on to list all the capitals, that all of the major capitals of Eastern Europe, and then he listed them, have fallen behind, and here's the phrase, an Iron Curtain, and he is announcing the Cold War. And he gives us that phrase. We still use it today. We still teach it today, at least I do. And Stalin took umbrage at this. He felt that Churchill had announced a new declaration of war. And again, for Stalin, control of Eastern Europe. For Stalin, turning all of Eastern Europe into a gulag, into a prison colony. His rule was grotesque. And it will be Truman, you know, who will push back, you know, with the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the trying to keep the Soviets out of Eastern Europe. And he did, to a large extent. And it will be Harry Truman. When Harry Truman leaves office in 1952, he chooses not to run in 52. He had had it. He had had it. He was exhausted. His wife wanted him to come home. She spent more time in Missouri than she did at the White House, which bothered Harry Truman. And he missed her, Beth. And when Harry Truman leaves office, his public opinion ratings are lower than those of Richard Nixon when Nixon left office in August of 1974. Today, this morning, Harry Truman now is rated among the near great presidents, along with Wilson, along with Theodore Roosevelt. Not that Harry Truman would want that. You know, as he said, I did my job, and I did my job the way I saw I should do it. And Harry Truman was not concerned about his public opinion ratings. He was concerned about getting the job done as he saw it. As he said, there are 100 men in Washington who can do the job better than me, but it's my job, and I'll persevere. And today he's ranked among, and I know I've got some, you know, Truman supporters out there in wherever this is being presented. And Harry Truman said, it doesn't matter. I did the job as best I could. And the Roosevelt-Truman combination are so part of the framework of the Cold War and closing down World War II. So thank you, Franklin Roosevelt, and thank you, Harry Truman. So I'm asking my producer here, do we have much time left?
A half hour, 35 minutes.
Oh wow, 35 minutes, that is great. You know, which means that we can go elsewhere. You know, when, I'm gonna go back to the conference that preceded the Tehran conference, and that's the Casablanca Conference. The Casablanca Conference was in January of 1943. Remember, Tehran was in November of 42. Stalin wasn't there. Churchill and Roosevelt were at the Casablanca Conference in 1943. And in order to pacify Stalin, to make Stalin accept what he thought was a lie, that we will not cut a deal with Hitler, and then take out the Soviet Union, or however his mind was working, that at Casablanca we have the unconditional surrender. That neither Churchill or Roosevelt will accept an unconditional surrender from Italy, Japan, or Germany. Now, that promise was breached several times, but it was a promise made to Stalin that we will not cut a deal with Hitler. And Hitler had hoped that with the D-Day invasion coming, and he knew it was coming. He knew it was coming. It was only a matter of when and where. And when was important. Where was not as important as the when. And in order to placate Stalin, unconditional surrender. Stalin didn't believe it. Didn't believe it at all, that they will cut a deal and I will be left to bear the burden of the last German assault. Didn't happen. When Eisenhower finally, after the Battle of the Bulge, and we've talked about that earlier when we've had our in-person conference, after the Battle of the Bulge, when British and American soldiers crossed the Rhine River, that as American units began to liberate, free, defeat the first German cities as they crossed the Rhine River, they were really concerned and didn't quite know what this meant, that when they entered the German villages and towns, the scratched into the walls with whitewash, so it's not even scratched, on the walls of buildings were the initials HH. And no one knew what that meant. Retreating German soldiers, HH. And it meant Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler. And in some villages, the numeral 88 was placed. And that was even more perplexing. Why 88? Why 88? And obviously, the numeral 8 is the eighth letter of the alphabet, which is H. So it's Heil Hitler, whether it's HH or 88. So Eisenhower expected a fierce resistance somewhere, and that's why he slowed down. He slowed down so that Stalin would be able to take Berlin, Hitler's capital, the trophy. And Roosevelt had promised that to Stalin, that you may take Berlin. American forces, will not attack or try to take Berlin. Eisenhower, years later, wished he had. It may have completely changed the complexion of the Cold War. But as Commander-in-Chief, Roosevelt and General Marshall told Eisenhower, pull back, allow the Soviets to take Berlin, and you swing south, because somewhere in the Black Forest or somewhere, the Germans are going to make their last resistance, their last stand, and I want you to swing south and take that out. And that's how they saw 88 HH. So the capture of Berlin, and again, at Yalta, not only was the topics that we've talked about, but also at Yalta was some talk about how to deal with Germany. Should we execute the officers? Should we turn it into Heidi's pasture, or should we divide it up? And that became the division of Germany: East and West Germany, East and West Berlin, which lasted until Gorbachev, and the end of the Cold War. So there we have it for this morning, a kind of a roundabout. And typically, which we don't have here, typically at this point, I would open it up for questions, and there would be a tsunami of questions from all parts of the room. But we don't have it here today. And it's me, it's you, and it's my producer who wants to make sure that I don't lose track of where I am, and I know I've done it, and to watch the time for me. So good night, good afternoon, good luck, and thank you. Thank you for your company, and I hope sooner rather than later we can get back to our traditional venue where we can chat, and I can make fun of people, tell jokes, and I can take questions, because the questions lead me to other parts of the conversation that we have not explored deep enough. So, good afternoon. Thank you for your company.